My grandmother pickled every vegetable in a bed of rice-bran that never fully emptied, feeding it by hand in a farmhouse in Tono before anyone she knew owned a refrigerator. She never called any of it science, but 25 of the small things she did in that kitchen have since been measured and confirmed by food scientists, some of them nearly 80 years behind her. None of it was ever banned, and later in this video, the true story of what Japan actually banned in the 1960s comes out, stranger than the one going around. My name is Mika Sato, and I've run a household of 7 on 1 income for more than 25 years without ever hiring help, the same way she ran hers. Here are the 25 things she got right. I want to be straight with you before we go any further, because honesty is the only thing that makes a video like this worth your time. Nothing you're about to hear was pulled from a rumor or dressed up to sound bigger than it really is. 25 habits, sorted into 3 families, each one grounded in a real mechanism you could explain to a child with a spoon and a bowl of salt. The first family is the invisible science of taste, the reason a bowl of plain broth can carry an entire meal inside it. Fermentation makes up the second family, the habits that kept a household fed for months at a stretch before anyone owned a refrigerator. A few of them are still sitting in jars in my own kitchen in Sendai right now. Small daily moves that look like superstition round out the third family, and they turn out to be plain physics and chemistry, done with nothing more than a pair of hands and patience. None of what follows came from a certificate or a course. It came from my grandmother Fumiko, who ran a farmhouse in the mountains of Tono with almost nothing to spare. It also came from more than 25 years of running my own household of 7, in a city where I started out knowing no one. In Tono, if you wasted something, you felt it that same winter, and that feeling never leaves you. It teaches you to notice which habits actually hold up, because the ones that don't work get thrown out fast, and the ones that survive get passed down without anyone ever writing a word of it. Let's start with the one that isn't folklore at all. It's on the record, with a name, a year, and a laboratory attached to it. The first thing my grandmother was right about is the taste itself, the one sitting underneath every other flavor in a Japanese kitchen. In 1908, a Japanese chemist named Kikunai Ikeda sat down with a pot of kombu dashi and asked a question nobody in food chemistry had bothered to ask before. He wanted to know what exactly was making this plain seaweed broth taste so full on its own, with nothing else added. He isolated the answer as glutamate, the compound behind what we now call umami. He named the 5th taste decades before the rest of the scientific world caught up and recognized it as a basic taste alongside sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Nobody had named it before he did. My grandmother never read Ikeda's paper, and she never needed to. She built a broth around that same compound every single week of her life, using kombu she kept dry in a tin above the stove. Her own mother had taught her that a good dashi needed almost nothing added to taste complete. The chemist and the farmhouse cook arrived at the same fact, from opposite directions, decades apart, and only one of them got the credit for discovering it. The second thing she got right is what happens the moment you stop using kombu alone. Kombu carries glutamate. Katsuobushi, the dried, smoked, and aged bonito shaving sitting in almost every Japanese pantry, carries a second compound called inosinate. Putting the two together in the same pot doesn't just add the flavors up, it multiplies them. Sensory testing shows the effect peaks near an even ratio between the two compounds and can taste 8 to 30 times more savory than either one alone. A researcher named Akira Kuninaka documented that multiplying effect in 1960, more than 50 years after Ikeda's first discovery. Ikeda's own student, a chemist named Shintaro Kodama, was the one who traced inosinate back to katsuobushi in the first place. It took 3 separate researchers working across 3 separate decades to fully explain a pairing every dashi cook already trusted by feel. My grandmother never measured a ratio in her life. She just knew that kombu and katsuobushi belonged in the same pot together, and that knowing came from taste repeated for so many years, it stopped feeling like a decision at all. The third thing she got right is knowing when not to boil. Most people assume dashi needs real heat to pull the flavor out of kombu, so they bring the pot up hard and wonder why the broth turns faintly bitter and slightly slimy. Kombu holds compounds that heat breaks apart and releases straight into the water, and those happen to be exactly the compounds nobody wants in a clean-tasting broth. My grandmother made what's called miso dashi, cold-brewed kombu dashi, by dropping a strip of kombu into a jar of cold water before bed and letting it sit in the icebox overnight. By morning, the glutamate had moved slowly into the water without pulling any of the bitterness along with it, using nothing but time instead of heat. The fourth thing she got right sits at the very end of the pot, not the start. Miso stays alive with beneficial microbes built up over months of slow fermentation, and dropping it into liquid that's still boiling hard kills those microbes and drives off the aroma that took all those months to develop. My grandmother always turned the burner off first and waited for the bubbles to settle into a calm simmer. Only then did she stir the miso in, through a small strainer, working it into the broth in slow circles until it disappeared. She couldn't have told you a single word about bacterial cultures. She only knew that miso soup made her mother's way, added at the very end, tasted like something alive, and miso soup boiled hard, tasted like something that had already died. That's the taste side of the kitchen. Now the part that kept an entire household fed through a winter with no refrigerator anywhere in the house. The fifth thing she got right is the jar I mentioned at the start of this video, the bed of rice-bran called natto that she kept alive for years. She fed it by hand the way you'd feed a living thing. Vegetables buried in that bran bed for even half a day come out changed. A cucumber left in natto for 12 hours can carry up to 10 times more vitamin B1 than the same cucumber eaten raw. Daikon left in that same bed can carry up to 16 times more. The lactic acid bacteria and yeast living in the bran spend that time breaking the bran down, passing its nutrients straight into the vegetable buried inside it. My grandmother never measured vitamin content in her life. She measured it by how the cucumber tasted the next morning, and by how her children made it through a Tono winter without falling sick on food kept this way. The sixth thing she got right is making her own miso instead of buying the instant packet from the store. Home miso relies on a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, or koji. It spends months slowly breaking soybean protein down into glutamic acid, the same amino acid behind umami, while building up vitamin B12, vitamin K2, and living gut bacteria along the way. The instant packet skips almost all of that time, and the version I still keep at home takes the better part of a year to finish. I've never found a shortcut that tasted the same, and I've stopped looking for one. The seventh thing she got right is trusting koji itself, the same mold behind miso, soy sauce, sake, and mirin. For most of the 20th century, koji sat in Japanese pantries doing its slow enzymatic work while almost nobody outside Japan paid it any attention. These days, fine dining kitchens across the West study koji the way a chemist studies a new ingredient, because the enzymatic breakdown it produces can't easily be faked with anything faster. My grandmother just called it the mold that made the soybeans taste like something. The eighth thing she got right is natto, the sticky fermented soybeans made with a different bacteria entirely, called Bacillus subtilis. The smell alone turns newcomers away instantly. Natto carries an enzyme called nattokinase along with a heavy dose of vitamin K2, and both are still active subjects of ongoing research into bone strength and heart health. Most of my own children hated the smell of it as toddlers. All 5 of them eat it now, stirred with a little soy sauce and mustard over hot rice, the same way I did growing up in Tono. A Japanese cohort study that followed participants for 15 years found that people who ate more natto had a lower risk of dying during the study period than people who rarely touched it. That's a strange thing to prove scientifically about a food most of the world still can't get past the smell of. The ninth thing she got right is shio-koji, a salted koji paste used as a tenderizer that nearly disappeared once store-bought tenderizers took over, before home cooks brought it back years later. The enzymes inside shio-koji break down protein and starch on contact, and a tough cut of meat can turn tender within a single afternoon of sitting in it, with nothing added but koji, salt, and water. The 10th thing she got right is amazake, a sweet drink made from those same koji enzymes working on rice starch instead of meat protein. It turns plain rice sweet without a spoonful of refined sugar anywhere near it. My grandmother kept a jar of it going through the coldest months of the year, the same way some households keep a pot of coffee going all winter long. The 11th thing she got right is her rice vinegar, made the old lactic fermented way instead of the fast industrial way most bottles are made today. Research has linked rice vinegar to measurable effects on blood pressure and blood clotting, and the old fermented version carried extra umami-rich amino acids that the modern fast version lost somewhere along the way. My grandmother's vinegar took weeks longer to finish than the kind sold in town, and switching over never once crossed her mind. The 12th thing she got right is umeboshi, the salt-cured plum tucked into the center of a rice ball. The citric acid and antibacterial compounds inside a properly cured umeboshi kept rice edible for hours with no cooler bag and no refrigeration anywhere nearby. That's exactly why it rode along on lunches, carried out to the rice fields long before anyone had a way to keep food cold on the go. The 13th thing she got right traces back to the very origin of sushi itself. Long before sushi meant fresh raw fish over vinegared rice as a delicacy, it meant narazushi, fish packed in salted rice and left to ferment for months until the acid built up enough to preserve it safely. Vinegared sushi rice today runs on that same principle, just in a faster form. Flavor was never the genius in the original dish. What mattered was keeping fish edible without ever once freezing it. The 14th thing she got right is patience with soy sauce itself. Naturally brewed soy sauce spends months fermenting in a mash called moromi, building the same deep amino acid flavor that a fast chemical hydrolysis process tries to shortcut in days instead of months. My grandmother bought hers from a small maker near Tono who still brewed it the slow way, and she wouldn't have traded it for a cheaper bottle, no matter how far she had to walk to get it. 10 items about taste and ferment, and not one of them needed a factory to work. Before I go on to the last 11, let me mention something briefly and then pick the list right back up. I've gathered the fuller version of Fumiko's household methods, cooking and cleaning both, in one place for anyone who wants it, and the link sits below this video if you'd like to look through it later. Now back to the kitchen, because the next 11 items have nothing to do with fermentation at all. They look like superstition, and they're really just physics and chemistry wearing an apron. The 15th thing she got right is grating daikon raw and serving it right alongside fried food. Raw daikon carries digestive enzymes, including amylase, protease, and lipase, that help break down starch, protein, and fat before your own stomach has to do all the work, and those enzymes can't survive heat. Amylase breaks down around 50 degrees Celsius, protease around 42, and lipase around 32, so the moment daikon is cooked, the digestive benefit disappears with it. The pairing of grated raw daikon with fried food goes back to the Edo period, centuries before anyone in a laboratory measured those enzyme temperatures and confirmed the old pairing had been right the whole time. The 16th thing she got right is akunuki, soaking wild mountain vegetables in ash water or plain water before cooking them. Foraged greens carry bitter and mildly toxic compounds, including oxalates and certain alkaloids, and the soak pulls a real, measurable amount of those compounds out before the vegetable ever reaches the pot. This was never folklore dressed up as caution, it was the only food safety test a mountain family in Tono had. The 17th thing she got right is using ash or lye water to process foods that would otherwise be inedible or even harmful, including konnyaku, warabi mochi, chestnuts, and bamboo shoots. That step is genuine alkaline food chemistry, changing the structure of tough or bitter compounds until the food turns safe and pleasant to eat. Nobody in Tono called it chemistry, they called it the way you make bamboo shoots edible, and they'd been doing it for longer than anyone could trace back. The 18th thing she got right is shiomomi, rubbing salt directly into cucumber or cabbage with her hands before serving it. Salt pulls water out of a vegetable through plain osmosis, and that lost water carries some of the vegetable's own harsh, watery bite out with it, leaving something crisp, seasoned, and ready to eat within minutes instead of hours. My grandmother did it with her bare hands over a wooden bowl, the same way her own mother had shown her. The 19th thing she got right is odoshibuta, the drop lid that rests directly on the simmering liquid instead of sitting over the rim of the pot. It needs no stirring at all. A drop lid pushes the simmering liquid evenly across the ingredients on its own, and it softens the violent bubbling that would otherwise tear a delicate piece of fish or vegetable apart. It also cuts down how much liquid evaporates, so what's left in the pot finishes concentrated and full of flavor. My grandmother owned a wooden one, worn smooth from decades of use, and she reached for it before she reached for anything else in her kitchen. The 20th thing she got right is wrapping food in bamboo leaf and shiso instead of plastic. Bamboo leaf, called sasa, carries natural compounds that hold back spoilage bacteria and cut down odor, while letting enough air through that food stays fresh without turning soggy or moldy underneath it. Shiso leaf carries a compound called phytoside, with real antiseptic properties, strong enough to slow spoilage in raw fish. That's exactly why shiso ended up wrapped around early sushi in the first place. Long before it became a garnish nobody thought twice about. The 21st thing she got right is toasting sesame, nori, and spices in a dry pan before using them, instead of adding them straight from the bag. That short pass over heat triggers the Maillard reaction, the same browning chemistry behind a properly seared piece of meat, and it builds aroma compounds that were never there in the raw ingredient to begin with. 30 seconds in a hot pan changes the whole dish, and my grandmother never skipped that step, no matter how much of a hurry she was in. The 22nd thing she got right is keeping tsukemono, ordinary lacto-fermented pickles, on the table at almost every meal. Those pickles carry live lactic acid bacteria, the same kind now studied closely for what it does for the gut microbiome. Sitting there as an everyday side dish, instead of anything special, nobody in that farmhouse called it a health food. It was just what went next to the rice. The 23rd thing she got right is how carefully she washed rice before cooking it, rinsing quickly, draining fast, and never letting the rice sit in that first starchy water. That first rinse carries away surface starch and impurities fast enough to keep the grain from turning gummy. A controlled soak afterward lets water reach the center of each grain evenly, and that's exactly what gives properly cooked Japanese rice its particular bite. Skip the careful rinse, and the texture changes even if every other step stays the same. The 24th thing she got right is never pouring that rinse water down the drain. Togi jiru, the starchy water left over from washing rice, went straight into a pot to cook vegetables, or out to the garden, because throwing it away felt like throwing away food itself. That instinct has a name in Japanese, matenai, a kind of regret over waste paired with the will to reuse instead of discard, and it runs through nearly everything else on this list. The 25th thing she got right is kazuzuke, pickling and marinating fish and vegetables directly in sake lees, the solid leftover paste from brewing sake that most kitchens today throw straight in the bin. That leftover paste is still full of active fermentation, and packing fish or vegetables into it for even a few days pulls in a deep, almost caramelized flavor while curing the food at the same time. 25 items, and every single one comes down to the same idea. Nothing in that farmhouse ever went to waste, not the rice water, not the sake lees, not a single vegetable passed its best day. Now for the part I promised you at the start of this video, the true story of what Japan actually banned in the 1960s. And it has nothing to do with any of the 25 things you just heard. Japan's food safety law works on a clear line. It regulates the additives put into food, not the techniques a home cook uses to prepare it. So there has never been a list of banned home cooking tricks, because that simply isn't what the law covers. What the law did target, in the exact decade this video is named for, were 3 synthetic industrial additives, a preservative called AF2, and 2 artificial sweeteners called dulcin and sodium cyclamate. AF2 spread through Japanese processed food in the mid-1960s, added to fish sausage, fish paste, and packaged tofu to fight spoilage, and it looked safe under the testing methods available at the time. Sharper testing in the early 1970s found that AF2 caused chromosome damage in human cells and mutations in bacteria, and follow-up animal studies found tumors as well. Dulcin caused liver damage and a rise in mortality in animal testing at fairly ordinary dietary levels, and American regulators had already called it a poisonous substance with no place in any food. Japan banned dulcin and sodium cyclamate in January of 1969 and pulled AF2's approval entirely by 1974. The AF2 story has a stranger public chapter attached to it. The one I promised you was odder than the version going around. In May of 1969, a Japanese television program called Afternoon Show aired a live demonstration meant to prove AF2 was dangerous, and a commentator dropped AF2 dissolved in alcohol into a tank of goldfish on camera. Within minutes, the goldfish were dead, and the broadcast set off a wave of public alarm that no laboratory paper could have matched on its own. AF2's manufacturer sued the commentator over the stunt, and a court eventually ruled in 1974 that the alcohol used to dissolve the AF2, not the AF2 itself, had killed the fish that day. That single detail didn't clear AF2 of anything, because separate researchers using entirely different methods had already confirmed its damage to human cells and its tumors in animal testing years before that broadcast ever aired. All that court ruling ever settled was what killed the goldfish on a television set. It said nothing about what the additive did inside a human body over months of ordinary eating, and the ban that followed had nothing to do with that single television stunt. None of that runs backward. Scientists have since refined exactly how dangerous AF2 was at the doses people actually consumed, and that refinement is real. Nobody has walked back the decision to pull any of these 3 out of the food supply, and nobody calls them genius today. That's the honest stranger story hiding behind the word banned, and it's also exactly why I want to be careful with you about the 25 items in this video. Fermenting and preserving food carelessly at home carries a real risk of food poisoning, including botulism. Treat everything you just heard as the reason the old methods worked, not as a set of instructions to try without care or guidance of your own. 25 separate habits, and really just one household running on a single idea. Waste nothing, trust what's already been tested by years of repetition, and let the scientists catch up whenever they get around to it. None of what my grandmother did in that Tono farmhouse was primitive. It was unrecorded science, sitting quietly in a kitchen instead of a laboratory, and the real loss was never a ban. It was simply forgetting. You don't need a laboratory to test any of this in your own kitchen, and you certainly don't need a certificate. You need the same 3 things she had: plain attention, a willingness to repeat a small habit long enough to notice whether it actually works, and the patience to let it prove itself over months instead of one afternoon. That was always the real inheritance, passed down through use instead of paper, and it's still sitting there waiting for anyone willing to pick it back up. The next video picks up right where this one leaves off. Inside the same farmhouse habit of keeping only what earns its place in a house, the old idea the Japanese called danshari, Come back and tell me in the comments which one of these 25 surprised you the most, because I read every single one.